This is a Bibliomotion audiobook, produced and distributed by Gildan Media in partnership with Bibliomotion. The Psychology of Eating and Drinking, 4th edition, by Alexandra W. Logue, read by Karen Saltus. We hope you enjoy this program. Preface. When I was a year old, I stopped eating everything except bread and milk. For years, my diet showed little improvement, and by 15, I was eating mostly meat, milk, potatoes, bread, orange juice, and desserts. I did not eat pizza, spaghetti, or any other food that I considered foreign. I avoided soda, fresh fruit except bananas, vegetables except peas, carrots, and beets, and cheese except grilled American cheese sandwiches. Fish I regarded as poison. My parents were not alarmed. I come from a long line of people with unusual food preferences. My mother, by choice, rarely served fresh fruit or fish at our home. She never served liver, which she hates, although my father loved it. He always ate first the food he disliked most, and many times I saw him finish salad and string beans before touching baked potato and steak. When I was a child, my mother frequently recounted to me how her grandfather would eat chocolate cupcakes but not cake made from the same batter. He said that the cake gave him indigestion. At home, my parents gave me vitamin pills and basically let me eat whatever I wanted. But everywhere else, I had to contend with sticky social occasions in which I was served what I abhorred eating. Just imagine going to a birthday party and not being able to eat the soda and pizza that everyone else was eating. Food aversions were not the only troubles of my youth. Food preferences also gave me problems. Although I disliked many things, when I did like a food, I could eat it at any hour of the day or night. My Southern grandmother was happy to feed me fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and hot biscuits dripping with butter whenever I wished. It was not easy to keep my weight at a reasonable level. One of the most dangerous places for me was the farm of my great-aunt and great-uncle in South Carolina, where the dinner table groaned with a great many things that I loved to eat. One exception was the milk from their cows. Although I relished it when it came back from the packager, I found milk totally unacceptable when it came straight from the cow, even though my great-uncle had pasteurized it. Two things saved me from an unhealthy preoccupation with eating and not eating certain foods: my husband and my study of experimental psychology. My husband was known in childhood as the HGP, or human garbage pail, because of his voracious and indiscriminate eating habits. Through example, pleading, and occasional bullying over the 40 years of our marriage, he now has me regularly eating, and sometimes even liking, vegetables, fruits, and different types of ethnic food. No one, under any circumstances, will ever get me to eat fish. Becoming an experimental psychologist, the other saving factor, channeled my former embarrassment into research enthusiasm. As a graduate student, I was continually drawn to research on eating and drinking behaviors. Sometimes I conducted studies that grew out of hypotheses I had about the origins of my own eating peculiarities. Only much later did I realize that a great deal of psychology focuses on eating and drinking. As a graduate student at Harvard, I was encouraged to pursue my interests wherever they led, a strategy that prepared me well for writing this audiobook and its predecessors. As part of my studies, I taught a small seminar for sophomore psychology majors. I was expected to come up with a topic for a year-long tutorial that would integrate material from many areas of psychology. I chose eating and drinking. Later, as an assistant professor at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, I created a new lecture course, The Psychology of Eating and Drinking. Although it was an advanced, non-required course, it grew in popularity each year. Toward the end of my years at Stony Brook, literally hundreds of students from many different majors tried to get into the course each time I taught it. Unfortunately, I could not take them all. In the first years of the course, the students read only original articles. The only textbooks that were at all relevant covered isolated topics such as hunger or alcoholism. The lack of a suitable text for my course and the enthusiasm of my teaching assistants and students finally convinced me that I should write a textbook for the course. The result was the first edition of The Psychology of Eating and Drinking. The story of my path to writing The Psychology of Eating and Drinking would be incomplete without mention of Paul Rosen, the ultimate food psychologist. I first met Paul in 1977 at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was pursuing research on why people eat chili pepper. That first meeting with Paul and his wife Elizabeth, cookbook writer and culinary historian, and the time we spent in their kitchen catalyzed my interest in the psychology of eating and drinking, and the effect has not yet worn off. Liz's first cookbook, The Flavor Principle Cookbook, has been my favorite ever since, and I doubt if that will ever change. The present audiobook, similar to the previous text versions of The Psychology of Eating and Drinking, describes scientific inquiries into eating and drinking behaviors. However, the audiobook does this in such a way that the material is completely understandable to the educated layperson. You need not have had any courses in psychology or courses in any science, for that matter, to understand what's written here. The only requirement for reading and enjoying this audiobook is that the listener be willing to approach psychology as a science. One of my goals in writing all of my books has been to show how much can be learned by applying scientific methods to the study of behavior. Should you wish for further information on any topic, the extensive references listed in the accompanying PDF will assist you. But you can also just listen to the book all the way through, or selected chapters, without being concerned with the sources of the material. I have elected to cover only those aspects of the psychology of eating and drinking that seem well researched and interesting, and I have had to cover some of these only briefly. Complete coverage of the psychology of eating and drinking would require many, many volumes. This audiobook is meant only as an introduction. Nevertheless, when possible, I describe how the research was conducted, not just the results, so that you can judge that and other research for yourself. This audiobook covers the major eating and drinking disorders, but it will not tell you precisely how to diagnose or treat your own or someone else's eating and drinking problems. The audiobook describes some of the principles for doing so, but real problem solving requires professional help. The relevant chapters list clinics and self-help organizations that may be useful in obtaining that professional help. 1. Introduction. The Essential Nutrients of the Psychology of Eating and Drinking. Sir Toby. Does not our life consist of the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water? Sir Andrew. Faith, so they say, but I think it rather consists of eating and drinking. Sir Toby. Thou art a scholar. Let us therefore eat and drink. William Shakespeare, 1623. 1936. Have you ever noticed just how much of your time is devoted to eating and drinking, or to thinking about eating and drinking? Pick a day and try keeping a record of the total time that you spend preparing or eating meals and snacks, as well as the time that you spend just thinking about the foods and drinks that you will or won't have. You'll likely find that far more time is devoted to these activities than to anything else, including sex. I once used a stopwatch to record how much total time I spent thinking about or touching food. My total was 4 hours and 33 minutes, and I'm not any more obsessed with food than is the average person. A great deal of the behavior of all animals consists of obtaining and consuming foods and liquids. It doesn't take a scientist to know this. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor stated in her autobiography, "And always food at the center of it all." But it does take a scientist to find out what causes these food and drink-related behaviors. And once we understand the causes, then we may be able to change these behaviors, something that a lot of people would like to do for many different reasons. For example, I'm sure that you've noticed that a lot of people consume so much of certain foods and drinks that bad things happen, such as weight gain from eating too much chocolate, high cholesterol from eating too much of certain kinds of fats, and liver damage from drinking too much alcohol. Why do people do these things? And even more intriguing, why do some people overconsume these foods and drinks more than other people, or only at certain times? Why do women tend to crave chocolate at certain points in the menstrual cycle, for instance? We need to understand the causes of behaviors such as these. Once we do, we'll have important information to guide us in modifying these behaviors. Our fascination with such eating and drinking behaviors and their causes has resulted in a huge industry of food-related pop science. Every bookstore, every magazine stand, every grocery store checkout counter is filled with publications about how to get your child to eat vegetables, how to tell if someone has an eating disorder, or most commonly, how to lose weight. TV programs and movies on these subjects abound. But the degree to which any of these is based on scientific research is very limited. Thus, the information and advice offered is, at best, incomplete and is often simply incorrect. Let's take as an example the advice that to eat less, you should drink lots of water. Have you ever heard that? Well, it's completely untrue. People don't eat less when they drink more water. And after you listen to this audiobook, you'll understand why. This audiobook is different from what you'll find in most magazines or books. It will introduce you to the scientific study of eating and drinking behavior. It will show you how scientists, particularly psychologists, conduct research on eating and drinking and what they have been able to find out so far. It will tell you many of the latest discoveries in this field. The answers aren't always simple, and they aren't always what we'd like to hear. But if you want accurate information about what causes our eating and drinking behavior and about what we can and can't do to change that behavior, you'll get that information here. And while you may not always be able to use that information to change your own behavior or someone else's, serious eating and drinking problems require professional help, you will get much immediately useful information. What's psychology got to do with eating and drinking? Most of the information in this audiobook is drawn from carefully conducted psychology experiments. Psychology is the science of behavior, the science of how and why organisms do what they do. So if your goal is to understand the behavior of people and other animals, as opposed to, say, the reproduction of plant cells, then psychology is your field. In this audiobook, we'll look at a certain set of behaviors, the behaviors involved in eating and drinking, using many different types of psychological approaches, from the physiological to the social. Our strategy will be to use whatever psychological science can tell us about these behaviors. We have something we want to understand, eating and drinking behaviors, and we're going to use every possible tool to gain that understanding. Psychology is the science of behavior, and therefore the analytical method that you'll see used throughout the entire audiobook is the scientific method. The scientific method assumes that the laws of nature govern all things, and that they do so in a consistent manner for all people and other animals at all times. Without this scientific orientation, it would be impossible to conduct experiments to determine the causes of behavior. In an experiment, all conditions are held constant except for one aspect that is manipulated by the experimenter. If this change in one factor is followed by a change in the behavior of the subject, the experimenter concludes that manipulating that factor has the observed effect on behavior. For example, you might take 10 people, ensure that they had eaten and drunk the exact same things for the 6 hours prior to dinner. Have half of them drink a quart of water right before dinner, and then measure how much they all ate during dinner. If, on average, the people who drank the extra water ate less than the other people, you could conclude that drinking lots of water decreases how much people eat right after drinking the water. Of course, this experiment wouldn't tell you what might happen at breakfast the next morning. The water drinkers might make up for their smaller dinners by eating larger breakfasts. You would need to do another experiment or expand your original experiment to determine that. All psychological scientists assume a scientific orientation in their work. The study of the psychology of eating and drinking is a huge but fascinating subject. It includes research on how you detect tastes, why you become hungry or thirsty, why you like some foods more than others, how you choose among foods, how certain foods can affect your behavior, and how and why we sometimes eat and drink in less than ideal ways. It would be impossible to cover all of the psychology of eating and drinking in one book, but I hope that this audiobook will give you a good overview, or more appropriately, a good taste of this subject. Getting there by degrees, evolution, and eating and drinking. In doing any kind of scientific investigation, it helps if you have some conceptual framework that guides where you're going. Some theory or theories that suggest how things work, so that you'll have specific ideas to test and ways to describe your findings as a whole. Psychological science, particularly psychological science as it's applied to eating and drinking behaviors, is often organized around the concepts of evolution and natural selection. The reason that the concepts of evolution and natural selection seem particularly appropriate for the psychology of eating and drinking is that every animal, including every person, must eat and drink appropriately or it will die. This means that any animal that has some genetically influenced behavior or anatomical trait that enables it to eat and drink well will be more likely to survive and will have more offspring than will other members of that species. Therefore, you would expect the eating and drinking behaviors of all species to have evolved over the millennia so as to be beneficial. You would expect that, by the process of natural selection, individuals who are well adapted with regard to how they eat and drink have survived and reproduced. Repeatedly in this audiobook, you'll hear me say that some way in which a species eats or drinks is adaptive and has helped that species to survive. At this point, I hope that you're saying, wait a minute. You're telling me that people and other animals have evolved to eat and drink well, but we all know, and you wrote yourself earlier in this chapter, that people eat and drink in all kinds of harmful ways. If we have evolved to eat well, why is it, for example, that people eat so much chocolate that they gain weight? Just because natural selection is and has been in operation doesn't mean that all of the behaviors of every species will be perfectly adapted for every situation. In fact, there are several reasons why an animal's eating behavior might not be optimal. Just one such reason is that you may be observing the animal in a situation different from the one to which its species was adapted. We didn't evolve in surroundings where chocolate was easily and cheaply available around every corner. And with our advanced medical techniques, people usually don't die at young ages from overeating chocolate. Therefore, despite the harmful effects of overeating chocolate, those of us who are chocolate obsessed are still having lots of children. In this audiobook, you'll hear many explanations such as this of unhealthy eating and drinking behaviors. Getting down to the subject. Now that we have our theoretical framework for experiments on the psychology of eating and drinking, let's suppose that you're a scientist thinking about an experiment that you might do to find out why people like chocolate so much. Let's assume that you've read research suggesting that a particular gene results in people loving chocolate after they've had many years of exposure to it, and you want to find out for sure if that's true. Therefore, you design an experiment in which you'll take 50 people with identical genes. Give half of them chocolate from birth to age 25, while preventing the others from having any contact with chocolate during those years. And then test all of the participants' preferences for chocolate when they are and aren't hungry. Sound like a great experiment? Well, it is, but there are a few practical problems. To begin with, you'll never find 50 people with identical genes. Even finding 2 identical twins is hard. Second, what scientist is going to have the patience to do an experiment that lasts 25 years? Scientists are under great pressure to publish frequently in order to keep getting research grants and to get promoted at their universities. Third, where are you going to get enough money to do this experiment? The participants will expect to get paid for their time, which will be considerable. And 25 years of chocolate for 25 people will also cost quite a lot. Fourth, you might have to deprive the participants of food for a period of time in order to make sure that they're hungry. Is this ethical? Issues such as these have resulted in scientists often using animals other than people in their experiments, something that you're going to hear a lot about in this audiobook. This should give you some concern. After all, only people behave just like people. However, in addition to the practical considerations, when you're trying to understand people's eating and drinking behaviors, there are good reasons for using animals other than people in the experiments. If I've convinced you that evolution has shaped eating and drinking behaviors, then you must also accept that different species will have at least some similar eating and drinking behaviors. One reason for this is that some species have evolved from relatively recent common origins. For example, all mammals have ancestors in common, and therefore have some genes in common. Thus, the process of evolution ensures that, even if your primary interest is the eating and drinking behaviors of people, you can learn something of value from studying the eating and drinking behaviors of other species. Let's consider some of the advantages and disadvantages of using different species in our hypothetical chocolate experiment. As you hear this material, you should be able to see many similarities in the eating and drinking behaviors of different species, while at the same time noting significant differences in the ways that these different species interact with their particular surroundings. Let's start with the sea slug, Pleurobranchia. This slug is a carnivore, a meat eater. It's not much to look at. The beauty of this animal is definitely more than skin deep. Pleurobranchia, similar to people, has specialized cells, known as neurons, in its body that collect information about its surroundings and cause it to move. Together, these cells are known as a neuronal system. Pleurobranchia's neuronal system is less complex than ours. Therefore, its neurons are relatively easily identified and manipulated. Some of Pleurobranchia's neurons, called food command neurons, are responsible for making Pleurobranchia move automatically in order to eat food that it has detected. This is an example of a reflex, a specific response that occurs reliably following exposure to specific aspects of the surroundings. In such a case, no learning is involved. Scientists have been able to determine that what Pleurobranchia has recently eaten affects this reflex, Pleurobranchia's motivation, by influencing how much certain inhibitory neurons decrease the activity of the food command neurons. Whether or not this slug eats can also be affected by learning, Pleurobranchia's knowledge about which events occur together. For example, if an experimenter shocks Pleurobranchia whenever it eats, it will be less likely to approach and consume food. Exciting as it is to be able to see the precise changes in neuronal activity that represent changes in feeding behavior, the usefulness of Pleurobranchia as a model of our feeding behavior is limited due to this species' limited behavioral repertoire. To begin with, due to its carnivorous proclivities, Pleurobranchia would be useless in an experiment on chocolate. Let's consider using a mammal for our experiment. People are mammals, animals that suckle. Therefore, other mammalian species would seem the most likely choices for studies on the eating and drinking behaviors of people. In the early days of physiological investigations of hunger, one mammalian species, dogs, was a frequent choice for experimental subjects. Dogs, although technically considered carnivores, can consume a wide variety of foods, making their eating behaviors more similar to ours than is the case for Pleurobranchia. Dogs will, on occasion, eat chocolate. In addition, their social behaviors and ability to learn quickly can make them useful in studying a number of eating behaviors that are similar to behaviors seen in people. Some of the earliest and best-known feeding research with dogs was conducted by one of the most famous parents of psychology, Ivan Pavlov, beginning around 1900. Pavlov showed that if an attendant repeatedly gave a dog food, the dog would come to salivate simply on hearing the attendant approaching. If you have a cat, you have certainly seen something similar. See the illustration in the accompanying PDF. My pet cat, like everyone else's, went crazy when he heard any can being opened. Pavlov's research became the foundation of one of the two major branches of learning theory, the branch concerned with learned and unlearned reflexes that is known as classical conditioning. Nevertheless, despite the fact that dogs sometimes eat chocolate, they are rarely used in current research because they are relatively large in size, take a relatively long time to reach maturity, and are popular pets. Chimpanzees, another mammalian species, are close evolutionary relatives of people. Therefore, not surprisingly, many of their eating and drinking behaviors are similar to those of people. Conversation-making fact 1. Do you sprinkle salt on your French fries or on your eggs? Some monkeys also season their food. Travel to a small island called Kashima in Japan, and you might see a group of monkeys seasoning their sweet potatoes in salt water using a method that Japanese scientists saw develop about 60 years ago. In 1952, the scientists began giving the monkeys sweet potatoes to eat. The sweet potatoes were frequently covered with sand. In 1953, a female monkey named Emo began to wash the sweet potatoes. Emo would dip a sweet potato into the water with one hand and then brush off the sand with her other hand. By 1958, approximately 80% of the monkeys were washing sweet potatoes. During the period that most of the monkeys began to do this, the way that they washed the potatoes began to change. At first, the sweet potatoes had been dipped only in fresh water. By 1961, the potatoes were being dipped primarily in salt water. Further, the monkeys would take a bit of a sweet potato, dip it, and then take another bite, seasoning the sweet potato. Much yummier than plain sweet potato, and just like what we often do with our food. For example, just like people, chimpanzees are omnivores. They can eat fruit, insects, and meat. In addition, similar to people, chimpanzees use spatial memory to find and remember good food sources. Some of the most fascinating information about the eating and drinking behaviors of chimps has come from the pioneering investigations of primatologist Jane Goodall and her colleagues at the Gombe National Park in Tanzania, East Africa. Goodall was the first to discover that chimps make tools for obtaining food and water. Twigs stripped of leaves, to which termites cling when the twigs are stuck into their nests, and chewed up leaves that can be used as sponges to obtain water from tree hollows. See the figure in the accompanying PDF. Never before had a species other than ours been seen to construct tools. Goodall was also the first to discover that chimpanzees hunt other animals and consume their meat. Usually males engage in these hunts, and they demonstrate elements of cooperative hunting behavior. One chimp creeps toward the prey while other chimps position themselves to block the prey's escape routes. After the hunters catch and kill the prey, they often share the food among themselves, as well as with other chimps. The similarities between our and chimpanzees' eating and drinking behaviors are indeed remarkable. Yet it's precisely this close similarity that makes many people consider chimps an inappropriate choice for experiments. Because chimps are so similar to people, ethical constraints that would apply to using people in experiments might also apply to using chimps. There are also several practical disadvantages to using chimps in experiments. Just as with people, chimps are very expensive to maintain, can be difficult to handle, and take a long time to produce sexually mature offspring. For all of these reasons, psychologists have usually not worked with chimps or other primates in the investigation of eating and drinking behaviors. This brings us finally to the rat. Surprise! Perhaps the rat isn't your favorite animal, but without question, it's the favorite subject for experiments on the psychology of eating and drinking. There are many reasons for this. The rat's diet is diverse and very similar to that of people, which accounts for its ability to flourish for so many centuries in close association with us. Rats, for example, absolutely love chocolate. In addition, except that they can't vomit, the individual and social behaviors that rats use in avoiding poisons and identifying beneficial foods are in many ways similar to those of people. Further, laboratory rats, bred for docility, are easy to handle.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?